Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Holy Ourselves podcast, a podcast about becoming more authentic in our faith, especially when it comes to our sexuality and gender, and what it means to be whole before God, ourselves, and others in the midst of this crazy world, because it is definitely a crazy world. As always, you can support this podcast by becoming a patron. There's bonus episodes, like bonus drafts of things. You can input in questions and all of those. So go to patreon.com/holy ourselves and support the podcast. For today, I am joined by a very good friend, former boss, Bill Henson of Posture Shift. Bill, it's so good to have you here.
Thanks, Josh. It's an honor and joy to be with you, as always.
Yeah. Bill, for anyone who doesn't know Bill, which I'm going to have you introduce yourself, Bill has been a mentor of mine for a long time. Like I often say, Bill, you basically taught me everything I know about LGBT inclusion and care in the church. For anyone who doesn't know you, doesn't know Posture Shift, can you share a little bit about yourself and the ministry?
Sure. My wife and I, we have two grown kids. We've lived in Boston all these years, but now we live in Northeast Oklahoma to be near my parents as they enter their retirement. And our kids are off on their own in their new life. So I'm an empty nester. That means I'm doing a lot of landscaping projects to keep busy and focusing more effort in the work of Posture Shift. I founded the ministry in 2006. We've been at it 20 years now. We've got a training and consulting program for church leaders that helps them enhance inclusion and care of LGBT people in the church. And then, Josh, you are co-author of one of our leading resources, Guiding Families, 5th edition. It's a best practice care plan for parents and families of LGBT loved ones. And there's a big crossover benefit. We have parents that attend Posture Shift events, and we have pastors that really, really are blessed by reading Guiding Families. We put the two together and we can make churches and homes safer for LGBT people and start focusing on building their faith identity in Christ.
Yeah. That's, y'all right here. It's Guiding Families up on the shelf. So it's I recommend it a lot.
The book would not exist without Josh Proctor. His design eye and writing capability and organization of the content. Josh, you're more than co-author. You produced the project, so thank you.
Thanks so much. It was an honor to work on, and a lot of it came from the fact of just, like, I mean, I'm very serious. I've just learned so much from you. I continue to learn so much from you. I still remember the first time I went to a Posture Shift event, flying up from Colombia, and it just like put all the pieces together, for me when I was trying to figure stuff out. I was like, yeah, this is how it fits together. And what I have asked you to come on to talk to me about is just kind of what does it look like, this work and everything, in the rise of this culture war moment that we are in our world today. And I don't know if you're a prophet, Bill, but I remember you talking about this shift years ago.
Yeah.
When we would be at an event and you were noticing the signs very early on how these kinds of shifts were happening culturally, even back when a lot of people were like, that's not happening. So I would love if you could describe the rise of this culture war, both generally in society and within the church. Like, what does that look like? How have you seen it? Maybe what signs stood out to you, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So in the early years, 2006 to 2010, no one was hiring Posture Shift. But by 2010, Exodus was about to close. The research on reparative therapy was well documented, and the church knew that there had to be a different approach. But guess what? There wasn't a different approach. So Posture Shift ended up being founded ahead of a curve, and that curve was the church embracing an idea of being good missionaries to LGBT people and making sure that highly vulnerable and marginalized people feel cared for, loved, and protected. So from 2010 to 2020, massive, massive growth. We trained national leadership teams, national boards of directors, who then gave us permission to train their entire teams all across America or all across North America. You got us invited to do an event in Colombia. We did
Yeah.
events in Kenya and in the UK, and then more recently in Pakistan. So, like we've trained hundreds of thousands of church leaders in 20 years of work. So in 2023, when I'm invited to Los Angeles, I'm like, oh, I thought they would already have this down and wouldn't need us. In fact, I remember telling you all on the opposite end of the spectrum in 2018, I said, Josh and team, guess what? We might not exist by 2026 because like the church
Yeah.
is really getting this and they're starting to live it out. It just looks like
Yeah.
we're not going to be needed by that point. And so I get invited to LA and I'm like, why does a church in Los Angeles need our help, in 2023? Well, I went there just almost questioning, would we even have anything beneficial to offer this, metro city, a church on the West Coast. And instead I was hit with a massive wave of objections.
Wow.
They did not take our recommended train teams top down approach. They just invited me to come to be before their congregation on an evening event. I thought that meant they were ready for everything. But instead, minutes before the event, um, they were notified that we engaged trans people by their name and their pronouns, and all of a sudden, almost fired on the spot. They arranged a situation where the event could happen, and like it could go forth, but they would collect all the questions from the audience and then decide
Mm-hmm.
what questions they asked me and which ones they did not. But I mean, that was a shocking event. I thought it was a one-off, and then it kept happening. And then I thought it was an election year issue. And then the
Yeah.
election passed, and then it kept happening and expanding more and more. Now, the bulk of our events we're not encountering that. But if you add that up, 1, 2, 3, 4 situations where that's happening, all of a sudden it's like something new is happening here. And that's what I call a backlash. It's a season of backlash. And very sadly, it is hit the idea of reaching LGBT people with the gospel very hard, because now any consideration of kindness, tolerance, patience is suddenly viewed with tremendous suspicion. And so, like we're navigating this season, but, and again, most of our events, this is not holding churches back from making progress, but there is a segment of the evangelical world that is come to a dead halt where they will not advance anything on LGBT because they consider it to be some risk of heresy or something like that. One quick note, I just find it interesting that in a season of high deconstruction of faith and high de-churching, that's when instead of us becoming more missional, we're locking down the church to try to
Yeah.
guard against heresy, so to speak. Oh, I agree. Be concerned about heresies for sure. I agree with that. But simply saying it's kind of an odd time for the church to clamp down and become less missional. So very interesting.
Yeah, it really is fascinating because I remember it one of those moments that felt like when the church opened up a lot more towards Posture Shift, because I mean Posture Shift just sits in this really like Posture Shift reaches churches that sometimes I feel like when I like would shock people
Yeah.
sometimes of the churches that like open their doors to Posture Shift because it has done so well at communicating this understanding that reaching queer people, caring for queer people, does not have to communicate a change in belief, a change in
Yeah.
theology, on marriage, on sexuality, on these things, and being able to take that missional kind of posture. It felt like when the Supreme Court, over like the decision on gay marriage came from the Supreme Court, there was this kind of understanding from the church of like, okay, listen, the culture war in gay marriage is lost,
Yeah.
like it's not there. We can now focus on being missional. That's where it felt like this thing happened. And then but then it seemed like you were seeing these sudden signs of like increase of bullying, increase of victimization against trans people, some of these things, and then even before it was really seeing in the church. And I guess what do you see as the things that are contributing to this increased polarization, or do you primarily see it as like a political thing, a theological, something deeper?
Yeah.
What is your assessment?
You know, for years, the church really did not have to engage homosexuality at a leadership training level or something, because they could simply say, go to Exodus, go
Yeah.
see a counselor, go talk to someone who can help you, you know. So by the time we get to 2016 and gay marriage is legal, Exodus is gone. Exodus doesn't just go, it goes with the president of Exodus saying the principles upon which we were founded did not work. So the very president that was highly respected and remains
Hmm.
respected, as Alan Chambers is an amazing person. Um, and he actually, I was in Florida the night before Exodus closed. I did not know they were closing. He just called
Wow.
me up. I didn't even know he had my number. He invited me to dinner. And I'm like, why is Alan
Mm.
Chambers inviting me to dinner? Am I going to get yelled at? And he just told me at dinner, he said, tomorrow I'm closing down Exodus. And I'm just like, I was amazed that he trusted me with that information, but he did. And he just said, Bill, the missional approach has always been the most needed thing in this area, and you're already established, so carry it forward and do it well. Know you do that with my blessing. And I just thought, wow, I never even met this guy in my life. I was never part of Exodus, but here he is
Mm.
seeking me out and then treating me to a dinner and then like almost like commissioning Posture Shift, move ahead, you know. So it's like a very beautiful thing. But if you can imagine how much energy that the evangelical church did not have to exert because they could simply refer, and then not really have to process things. All right. Then
Right.
suddenly the church gets to a point where now we have to really engage people. Like we have to really decide, are we going to be respectful toward people or not? Are we going to engage people where they are? Or are we just going to refuse to do it? And like if you
Hmm.
got pitted as hateful toward LGBT folks in your secular job, like you could get terminated very quickly. So for
Oh yeah.
roughly 10 to 15 years, the evangelical world, I think, has had to go almost like radio silent if they have objectionable or, let's say, even insensitive views toward trans people or LGBT folks more broadly. All right, well, suddenly a culture war arises. There's an organic conservative uprising. Now there is like complete freedom to, I mean, Josh, it's very sad. Show the true heart. It's
Yeah.
total freedom to have the empowerment. Now I can say whatever I want to say about trans people, even on social media, and my friends will applaud me and laugh with me as I mock people. So
Yeah.
I would just say it's almost like it's a pent up having to have done the right thing, that now I no longer have to do the right thing. Now I can let out what's really in my heart. And it's very tragic that what is really in the heart is, it's just very, very ugly and dismissive of the human dignity of people. and it will openly mistreat and mock people without even considering the consequences of that. In fact, some people may even think that they're honoring God by mocking very vulnerable people. And I just say, take that to Jesus, face to face with Jesus, not the theoretical Jesus. Take it to Jesus face to face and just see what he thinks about that kind of posture.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the saddest parts of a lot of this is how then you have social media really playing into this, because so much of it is geared towards combative nature. So much of it is geared towards, the jabs that we can take. Like the algorithm picks these things up. And so then you have Christians and pastors trying to figure out how to communicate a message. And sometimes the ways that it's going, like the natural gear of some of these things leans into the combativeness. And we can talk about that a little bit. But one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, because I sometimes wonder how are we in this work of inclusion and care and training, maybe not like communicating it well. And you guys at Posture Shift, which everyone put this link in the bio, did a really good blog on the identity, called The Identity Crisis, on what is this like piece of identity, because that seems to be where churches really get held up on this topic of like, why are you using identity? Can you share a little bit about the blog you guys you wrote, and kind of the message of this around identity?
So I just think, yes, you're right. Right now, there's a segment of evangelical church leaders that they can look at people who have, imagine this, in a world of gay marriage, in a world that's very progressive, largely speaking, on LGBT matters, church leaders can encounter LGBT individuals who have moved out of romantic relationships, who have surrendered their sexuality to God, or who have always, since their youth, lived out singleness, celibacy, because they had a deeply formed traditional biblical sexual ethic that either they believed all along or that they came to, and it would no longer allow them to have the prospect of being in a romantic or sexual relationship with someone of the same sex. Mm-hmm. Imagine that church leaders are encountering that kind of person, but that individual still sees themselves as queer or gay or bisexual or pansexual or trans or what have you. And the language that they use to describe who they are, a piece of who they are, suddenly becomes the basis upon which church leaders are saying, you are still in an unrepentant state, all over words. And so I wrote the blog, The Identity Crisis, not because LGBT folks have an identity crisis. I wrote it because we've turned words into idols in a way. Like, in a sense, we've forgotten that to listen to people's stories. And so in that blog, I wrote that before anyone has a sexual inclination, a sexual thought, a temptation, a desire to look at pornography, a desire to date someone, a desire to have sex with someone of the same sex, before anyone has any of that sexual awakening at all, they already feel queer. And if you look at the base definition of queer, it simply means different. They feel different. Why? Because they have grown up feeling different throughout much of their development. So a lot of this originates, the identity originates at age 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years of age. And it's a boy that might not feel so comfortable with peers. Maybe it's just not comfortable with male peers. Maybe it's comfortable with all peers. It's a girl that might not feel like she's exactly in alignment with the interest, hobbies, talents of other girls. She likes to be in a boy's world. We're not creating stereotypes here. I'm just saying a kid that doesn't feel like other kids. It is an experience of differentness that's mapped into their life experience at a very early age None of that has to do with sex. And so when people identify as queer, I don't think sex. I don't think sexual activity. I don't shift from their story to behavior. I don't shift from their story or their disclosure to presuming all kinds of horrible behavior. I think, oh, wow, someone has taken the risk to share with me that they're queer. What does that mean to them? I can't know if I don't ask. So, wow, Jonathan, thank you for sharing with me a bit about your identity or your story. I'd love to hear more. Uh, Look, I think it's really critical that if we're going to reach LGBT people with the gospel, we need to listen to their story and connect Christ to their story. In other words, like the number one word that boys are called growing up who will later identify as gay, the number one word they're called is the F word. All right. I can't even say it. All right. The
Mhm.
average age that they first encounter that word, second grade.
Wow.
So non-sexually developed kids are encountering another kid that's just different. And now they're automatically assigning a label, a word to that has to do with sexuality, even though that in that kid's mind, there might not be any kind of awareness of any kind of sexual feeling or a desire at all. So just saying that, like, this idea of being different, it's not just because I feel different on the inside. It's because, oh, yeah, also people might have started to treat me differently. And the challenge is once that name calling starts, it often doesn't stop till the middle of middle school. Seventh or eighth
Yeah.
grade, it could be cool to have LGBT friends. But before that, it's like if a kid is different, and they haven't come out. They're not saying they're gay, but they're just different. It's not cool to have a friend that's different. So I think it's really important that church leaders understand someone coming to Christ, giving their sexuality to Christ, surrendering their right to act on that. That is not a small thing. That is a gigantic thing. And they are following Christ with their whole heart, soul, strength, and mind. The idea that they still identify as queer is just saying, well, I still grew up feeling different, you know. And by the way, if you're asking me to now say I'm not queer, it's like asking me to say I'm straight, and I'm not straight, and I'm not going to lie before God,
Yeah.
and I'm not going to leave all kinds of confusion out there. So I'm
Hmm.
queer, and I've given my sexuality and my life to Christ. I just don't know what's so complex about that.
Yeah, it's funny. So I've talked about this on the podcast before because it's one thing I've navigated now working in a church where I preach every so often, and I will have a sermon where I'm not talking about sexuality. I'm not sharing my story. I am literally just preaching. And we will have a person who's new, who's come in, and based on my mannerisms, maybe based on my clothing or something, they have now associated there's a gay man preaching. And now they're processing whether they want to be in a church where a gay man preaches and then maybe going to someone else on staff, not coming to me. And then the clarification is, oh, well, Josh should explain his beliefs. He should explain his celibacy. Well, okay, so I do, but then if I do, the question is why you always have to talk about it. So we put queer
Exactly.
people into this situation where the assumption is being pressed upon you, whether you want it or not, and then the question becomes, do you just allow people to just make the assumptions or make their things, but then there's going to be a lot of assumptions made otherwise? Or are you constantly clarifying, constantly explaining who you are, and then therefore, why are you always talking about it? And there becomes an
Right.
over focus on it.
Yeah.
And and the
Lost in the
reality
mix
is, like you
is,
talked about it, it doesn't have to do with behavior. So anyway,
yes,
continue.
yes, exactly. Lost in the mix is that, like, I don't know, maybe because Josh so loves Jesus, he gave his sexuality to God and his right to act upon it, and had like pursued a theology degree or two, and like is actually preaching the scripture because of your deep love for Christ and your joy in, you know, preaching the gospel in the most holistic way of
Yeah.
where you're at in the scripture and what it's teaching. All of that gets deconstructed because of things like this. Oh, but I know he identifies as gay, therefore this
Yeah.
doesn't count, you know? So I
Hmm.
just consider that
Yeah.
legalism. And honestly, in the worst expressions, it becomes spiritually abusive.
Yeah. Yeah. And so in this then, because gosh, we could sit in that for so long. I think one example I was giving to you earlier that I'll share here is because I've been working on this in my own writing, is the example of when we talk about this thing of like, yes, it has to, maybe yes, queer identity has to do with attraction, maybe yes, it has to do with gender identity, but like it evolves culturally beyond these things to what it means and how it engages with people. It's similar to this understanding of eunuchs in the Bible. Again, everyone listening, I'm not saying eunuchs are queer people, not making this connotation, but there is a similarity that yes, at its base, a eunuch means a castrated man, but culturally then it develops to the point that when Jesus in Matthew is talking about eunuchs, he's not talking about people who are castrated. Like he's no longer
Yeah.
solely talking about this group of people. He's talking about people that have decided to be celibate or who do not fit into the familial structure and the things that can be learned from them. So this identity gets broadened beyond what the core like meaning was initially. And it's the evolution of identity, how it
Yeah.
evolves both individually
Yeah.
and culturally.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Josh, the reason I say legalism is because right now, side A affirming gay Christians can probably be encountered with more grace in the evangelical church than side B. And
Mm.
the reason is very tragic. The reason is because if you're side A, you are not a Christian. Therefore, I can engage you and
I can see
include
you as
you
out there.
and do all these things because you're not there. But once you say you're a Christian, once you adopt a traditional view, you have now become a Christian. And now, if you even use any of that language, you are still living in a state of unrepentant immorality. Church discipline kicks in. So I don't think many side A gay Christians are going to become traditional believing if they watch traditional believing Christians give up their life to follow Christ with their whole heart, soul, strength, and mind, and then watch the church tear their faith to pieces. And that's why I call it spiritually abusive. It is abusive to tear down a person who has come to Christ in the deepest way and surrendered something as innate as the desire to want to find someone to marry, to be with intimately, and to have a life partner, to give up that right to have that with sexual intimacy. That's not a small thing. That's a very, very huge thing. And to just dismiss all of that all over the criticism of a word, it's just honestly, it becomes a legalism.
Yeah, and it's so funny you say that because I've had this conversation sometimes with affirming queer Christians where they're like, "Well, the traditional church is going to accept you better than it accepts me." I'm like, I don't know if that's true necessarily, and maybe from the sense of, like it in an overt way, it's this weird part of like they accept affirming people because they can put them in the category of not seeing them as Christians at all, and
Yeah.
somehow they know where to put them, but then and I don't know if part of it's because we often have not really trained our muscles in Christianity of how to engage with other Christians that have different beliefs than us and how to like navigate that weird tension of you're not part of my
Mhm.
group of Christians, but you're still a Christian and how to engage with this. But we side B, celibate gay Christians, they're often hard for to be computed in. And
Yeah.
that leads me to my next question. Are there ways that you see or believe that maybe the way we've done the work of inclusion and care, are there ways that maybe we've been self-sabotaging or maybe not missing pieces in this work kind of contributing to this conversation?
Okay. So this is where side viewers probably don't or as much appreciate what I have to say. But I think
Okay.
it's really needed to say. Um,
Hmm.
I think when we use language that conveys that sexual sin is no big deal, I think it's a big problem. I think it's a big problem biblically, first and foremost.
Hmm.
But I believe it's a huge problem for the credential of the depth of our faith. So, like, like I know what is intended, but when we say too many times, oh, it's not a matter of salvation, okay, to say it one time, that is okay, but suddenly that takes us down a track where then we're just saying it in more aggressive ways. And and if we're not careful, increasingly what people are hearing is new doctrine. Sexual sin no longer matters to God. And look, I don't, if side B people believe that, they wouldn't be celibate and single, right? If they believed that sexual sin was no big deal, they would not give up their right to be in a sexual relationship or to get married. So let's be clear about that. However, I'm just saying sometimes our language is loose, and I think we would serve ourselves well in tightening up our language of what we mean and what we don't mean. And be careful and not make, in our ministry, I always tell our team, every word counts. We live by the ethic, every word counts. Every word
Hmm.
counts when we engage LGBT folks. Every word counts when we engage their parents and families. Every word counts when we engage the most conservative elders and staff. So if we really
Yeah.
want to establish deeper trust with evangelical leaders, our leaders, we do really need to speak in a clearer way, that we're not dismissing like sexual sin. And sometimes it just feels like the language there is a bit loose. And in a sense, we lose credential because of that. We open up ourselves to, honestly, appropriate criticisms. It's based on a miscommunication, but nonetheless, we opened up that door for that misperception to occur. So that's one thing I
Yeah.
think we can do better, is to tighten up our language and to actually say, no, sexual sin, it is a problem biblically. It's a human problem, not just a gay problem. It's a human problem. All humans struggle with it, but we're not dismissing the importance to God of sexual sin. Sexual sin
Yeah.
is to be repented of, and if we get off of that script too far, I think we're going to lose people, and they're going to start to say, "See, we knew it. It's heresy. It just took a while for it to come out. See, it doesn't really matter."
Hmm.
And to every side B'er I know, it actually does matter, because otherwise they wouldn't be living out the surrendered life that they're living.
Yeah. It's always so interesting because I think that often in how the church has naturally dealt with like like sexual sin, there's been this thing of where we can often over discipline maybe like a kid who looks at pornography, and then we brush under the rug the sexual abuse of a pastor, kind of thing over here. And then we engage in this. And sometimes when there's this conversation of trying to balance it out, it almost sounds like you're saying, oh, we shouldn't care about pornography or sex outside of marriage or something. It's like, no, I think that there's just things that we're not talking about. And then also, we're not having a restorative measure towards people who are caught up rather just like the disciplinary. And I agree with you in that, like, I think in these conversations I find side B celibate gay Christians want to promote the dignity of all queer people. Like
Yeah.
that's such a big part. We want to say that
Yes.
we believe all queer people have this deep dignity, and that kind of get this miscommunication of this moral relativism that kind of comes in. And
Yeah.
I've even had it where I've had this conversation. People are like, "Oh, so you're just celibate because you want to be?" And I'm like, I mean, not really.
I don't think
No,
so.
this is a much deeper thing. Yeah, like I
Yeah.
pursue this because it's a deep moral that based on ethics. So yeah, I catch that. It's like this really hard thing of how do we speak about it in this way that
Yeah.
is catching all of these important aspects.
Yeah. And by the way, you asked me about our own self-sabotaging. That sometimes we misconveying things in a clear way, but I don't I don't blame that when I'm before church leaders training them on posture shift. Like, I don't let them
Yeah.
comfort themselves with, like our weakness. I say, hey, look, as long as you've acclimated to pornography and divorce after remarriage and like whole denominations that won't subject their denomination to investigations from the outside regarding abuse of minors sexually, as long as all of that is just like no big deal, then you honestly no right to start parsing words with LGBT folks who have given their sexuality to God. Like, we have acclimated to
Yeah.
pornography. The lesson here is we acclimate to majority sins. And honestly, probably because of this spiritual conviction and frustration that is not biblical, we probably have a tendency to take it out and be extra harsh with regard to sexual and gender minorities. So that too is a self-sabotaging by the church, and so that's really important. There is one
Yeah.
more thing on this idea. I know not everyone will agree with me, but I just believe that if we could describe what we call side B, holding to a traditional biblical sexual ethic. If we could describe that as that the belief, what we believe, is a traditional belief. How we believe it is variable. Singleness and celibacy, celibacy on all of these categories, but singleness, living alone,
Yeah.
living with family members, living with a brother and his family, living with intentional community, chosen family, living in a celibate partnership, being in a mixed orientation marriage. That would not be available to a lot of folks. But I'm just saying, across the spectrum, that's how we live out what we believe. So when we say, what do you believe? Oh, I'm a side B gay Christian. Well, people are putting that in the what category, not the how. And all of a sudden, we're being accused of making up new doctrine. And anything new in the realm of doctrine is automatically going to be a suspect of a heresy. So I think we
Yeah.
could be more clear if we say, what do you believe? I believe in a traditional biblical sexual ethic. And how do you live that out? Oh, it's hard, but I live it out through singleness, celibacy, and by living my life with chosen family. I think if we could
Mm.
segregate those two things out a bit and not get confused as like saying we believe in a side B theology. Like, if we could separate those two out, I think we'd lower the rate at which people are misunderstanding us.
Yeah. It's often that separation of orthodoxy versus orthopraxy. Just
Yes.
the what the right belief and then the right posture, behavior, and stuff, and the reality of understanding the implications of it and how we live it out is separate in this.
Yeah.
So yeah, I appreciate you saying that, and I want us to talk a little bit more about that. We're for everyone later on. There's going to be an episode. Bill's going to join me on the Patreon. We're going to talk about a lot of this a little bit more in detail. But I want to get some more thoughts from you on some other stuff. So another thing here is that the Supreme Court just delivered their decision on Colorado's the Childs versus Salazar decision or case about Colorado's ban on conversion therapy practices, and it was a surprise. It was assumed that it was the Supreme Court was going to side with Childs, but the surprising part was that it was an 8-1 decision.
Yeah.
Um, and I guess obviously this by itself also could be a whole entire discussion, but I just wonder also within this kind of culture where Exodus is gone, but obviously there's these conversations happening around conversion therapy. How do you see this impacting the church's care for queer
Sure.
people?
Yeah. Well, on the construction of the ban, I had great criticism of the construction of the ban in the beginning, because
Hmm.
it went for the jugular. It it actually did prevent almost any kind of engagement, or at least it would raise the concern that there might not be an ability to engage and even ask any kind of questions from a care perspective at all. And we're
Yeah.
not talking about reparative therapy questions. We're just talking about engaging, particularly young people with gender dysphoria. All right.
Hmm.
So, like, I thought the law and the 8-1 ruling was actually a strange comfort to me, because when I saw
Mm.
8-1, I knew, oh, this is a very, very, this ruling is based upon an aspect of the law, not the idea of conversion therapy at all,
Hmm.
or the ability to have conversations. In other words, there's a technical matter here. And sure enough, they basically ruled that the law simply goes too far. So the key is, this
Yeah.
Supreme Court ruling is not eliminating the possibility for future bans. It's simply saying
Hmm.
bans are going to have to be constructed in a way where everyday conversations of care can continue to happen. And so I think that that's hopeful. It was a surprising defeat, but the 8-1 convinces me that even progressive justices were convinced that on the basis of law, this was a problem. Okay. And so
Yeah.
now, the sad thing of the ruling, it actually empowers an idea for believers with no knowledge in this area to simply presume that, yes, you know, people really can change. People can change if they only want to, if they only are willing to. If they're only willing to obey God, they can change. And this is help that's now available and they can access it.
Yeah. It's so complex with conversion therapy laws because I often feel that the people who a lot of times laws in conversion therapy, I think it becomes very obvious that the people who write it don't know what conversion therapy is sometimes,
Yeah.
because it's like, unless you've gone about it. I did think Colorado's was better than a lot of others, but there is a hard thing when you get into the speech. It definitely shows, as you're saying. I think the one thing that 8-1, and Rachel and I talked about this on the last episode of the podcast, to that it shows this is a very high value. This is a court that really high values speech, since that's what
Yeah.
the ruling was on, which gave it strict scrutiny. Hence
Yep.
why it had such a high bar to reach for it. And I guess I am wondering how this is going to empower, like you were saying, this belief that, oh, see, people can change, when we do have the research of showing what that means, and also the vagueness that sometimes exists in the church when we talk about change. Because this is where I would say, just as um, some conservative Christians can feel vagueness around gay identity, this is the vagueness I feel around the ex-gay identity, where you're like, I used
Yeah.
to be gay. But then when you get to the critique of what people mean by that, because Christians hear in that, oh, your attractions are gone. Often what people are meaning by that is they're not acting on it.
Right.
And so then there becomes this differentiation of it. So I'm intrigued to see how this changes that.
Yeah. In the worst scenarios, it would actually empower people who really are doing conversion therapy to continue to do very harmful things. And if
Yeah.
they do that in a coercive and a manipulative way, and parents buy into it and keep coercing their child to be in that setting, you could see an elevated rate of suicide attempt or completions. So the risk to youth is higher. It's just that I know so many Christian counselors that never, ever, ever wanted anything to do with reparative therapy. They only wanted to make sure kids are safe in families. Just like we know so many pastors that we're talking about a lot of like insensitive things that church leaders do today, but there are many church leaders that deeply love and care about LGBT folks. And these changes in the law are not going to change them from doing what they already know to do, to radically love people and love people in a tangible way that will build them up and create safety in their life. So
Yeah.
despite this ruling, I think it's a scary headline, But at the practical level, for the vast majority, over 90% of LGBT youth growing up, I don't think most of their parents are taking them to a conversion therapy setting. And we can praise God for that,
Yeah.
because in your generation, like there would have been a
Oh,
larger percentage of evangelical families that were actually believing in the hope of that and coercing their kid to be there. So hopefully that knowledge
yeah.
will play a bigger role than the headline.
Yeah, and I wonder, this is like, gosh, this is something I've been processing. I wonder a little bit of that differentiation between my generation and the new generation. I don't know what you feel about this, but this is something I've been thinking through. Is I wonder if that some of that shift is also because of the loss of influence of Christian institutions. And what I mean by that is
Mhm.
like one of the reasons why it was so powerful in my generation is every parent was listening to Dr. John, like Dobson, and Focus on the Family.
Yeah.
Like they had such a wide influence in evangelicalism that one voice had this ginormous influence.
Yes.
And in today's world, I don't know a Christian institution that has that level of influence across Christianity. Like you have spokespeople, you have denominations, you have some things here and there, but there's no real like group that's like really vastly influencing it. And so therefore you're going to get a lot of these things like where the
Yeah.
messaging isn't going to be as consistent as it was in my generation, where I feel like everyone had Bringing Up Boys,
Yeah.
or whatever the
Yes.
Dobson's book was. So I'm interested to see how that, even that like kind of fracturing of the influence of Christian institutions maybe plays into the fracturing of the messaging in
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
So
I believe so. And like I know they exist, but I'm just saying, even in the deep South, I don't know a single
yeah,
pastor that is suddenly thinking, "Oh, great, we can send
oh
kids to reparative therapy now." You know,
yeah,
uh,
totally.
so
Mhm.
the evidence of the effectiveness of that kind of treatment in accomplishing actual change in orientation has been so refuted across the board. Even evangelical universities have proven that this is a practice that should not be done in the church or by Christian practitioners. And so I think that knowledge of the harm that it's done is well founded. I mean, you think Boy Erased and other things. Sometimes if you're LGBT, we think that, oh, we're the only one that watched that movie. No, like an entire generation of evangelicals
Mm,
watched that movie. And so like that,
yeah,
like those things have left a mark that I think has brought education into this realm. So I think
yeah,
there's some built-in
totally.
protections. But, as other bands possibly get, challenged, and then how they end up at the Supreme Court, we'll see how other rulings come to play over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I have two more questions for you here, and then we'll hop on and go on the Patreon one. First of all, my one question for you is, so in this work that, and this rise of this culture war, how are you finding it effective to work with pastors and leaders and Christians to move away from this divisive culture war to a more like missional posture? Are there ways in which this ministry you feel like needs to begin to find a new approach, or how we're working with pastors and stuff to make that shift?
Yeah. I mean, all ideas are needed at the table. Let's be clear. I'm going to speak for Posture
Mhm.
Shift. The thing I'd say is the missional framework is timeless. It's God using people
Mm,
from everywhere to be sent everywhere to go reach all the people groups in the world with the gospel of Christ. That is timeless. It goes back to Abraham and before. Like and in the modern missions world, it is timeless. The model is consistent. So we're teaching a curriculum that is at an 80 to 90% level identical to what was being taught 20 years ago, because it's best practice missiology. And has a huge impact. So, as an example, a pastor from Canada recently called me. We trained their team, actually citywide leaders, in 2015. He said, Bill, hey, I'm just watching all the culture war stuff kind of explode in the US. It's really scary. He said, but I just wanted to call and I wanted to encourage you. We are still implementing posture shift teaching principles 11 years later. He said, when
Wow.
COVID hit and race relations exploded, we had no idea posture shift would equip us to apply and be a healing force in that season. And then when this culture war has broken out, we had no idea that posture shift would be what we're returning to over and over and over again to get insights on what's most needed. So what they said that they're doing, and what we've encouraged other churches that we're training right now, is preach the gospel to the entire body of Christ. Preach not the distracted gospel. Culture war is a distraction. By the way, it's an excuse. It's the easy way. Hey, if we can just defeat people, then God will be bigger. Well,
Yeah.
one, I think there's some biblical ideas that would confront that ideology very quickly. But two, even if you believe that, like that model can only work so long. It will die a death because it will prove to be ineffective. So I've encouraged them, and this pastor was saying, what we're doing, we're preaching best practice missiology combined with the gospel in nearly every message. In other words, we are actively calling Christians to repent of putting their hope in political outcomes, in earthly kingdom powers, and to come back to the body of Christ, where we're not called to have power over other people. We're called to be like Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking on the very nature of a servant. The pastors that are leading in this time of culture war are calling their congregation, die to self and find your identity and your attitudes and your behaviors at the foot of the cross. Look into the eyes of Jesus and ask him, is he saying, well done, good and faithful servant? And he will not be saying, well done, if you're mocking people, if you're considering religious victories are accomplished through political victories. If your hope is in all these earthly kingdom things, you're far from the kingdom of God. It has nothing to do with it. Sometimes I say, we need a new Billy Graham. I don't mean we need centralization in the evangelical world, but what I mean is Billy Graham refused to get distracted by any time, by any season. He always preached the gospel, only the gospel, every single time. He always thought about people who need to have a relationship with Christ and the way that happens. So in a modern context, I think we need all kinds of pastors kind of taking that humble, simple approach of preaching the gospel.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. That reminds me, your reference to Billy Graham reminds me of Greg Johnson's book, Still Time to Care, and this understanding of before even some of Billy Graham's postures on homosexuality and before the rise of the ex-gay movement and some of these things and the need for that kind of posturing today in it. All right, last question. What would you say to an LGBTQ Christian who feels exhausted in this culture war?
All right. We talked about the idea of church leaders really implementing church discipline over identity language. It's spiritually abusive. It is exhausting people. If our friends, if many of them that are being asked or being told you're out of serving in this area, some of our friends are being asked, you are no longer a member of this church, all because you still identify as gay or queer. Like, if all of this church discipline keeps going at this level, there will be the exhaustion will be so high that in our humanity, this would apply to anyone, gay or straight, in our humanity, a human heart can only encounter so much, can only endure so much. What I would say is I'm amazed at the resiliency of faith that even as side B gay Christians are being removed from this area of service, chastised for this, invited into a meeting where it turns manipulative toward church discipline, asked to leave a church, and they are not abandoning their relationship with Jesus. And they're not saying, that's it, I'm going to go out and comfort myself, and just go get a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a partner. Nope. They're hurting. They're rejected. It's hurt added to a lot of other hurt that's already accumulated in their life. And yet they're still holding on to Jesus. This is my affirmation. You're holding on to Jesus because your faith is real, because God lives inside you. He saved you because you are his beloved child. You have received salvation in him, and don't let anyone tear that to pieces, because what God has built into you, no one can say that that's not real, that that's not true, and that you're not following him with your whole heart, soul, strength, and mind. Find community in the body of Christ. Find family members that are safe. Come to Revoice, come to a Side B retreat. Be in fellowship settings where your faith can be renewed, where you can have the freedom to lift your hands up and worship God with your whole heart, soul, strength, and mind, and no one is questioning you to death. That's my encouragement to you. You have a real faith, and keep living it out. And you inspire me because you're holding firm and being courageous and strong in the midst of things that, honestly, if I was being treated that way, it might just deconstruct my entire faith.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Bill. Where can people learn, get connected with you, learn more about Posture Shift? How can people do that?
Learn more at postureshift.com, and you'll find us on Facebook and Instagram. You can simply search for Posture Shift, and you'll find us any of those places.
And pick up, y'all, especially parents. Guiding Families is a great resource. I recommend it all the time. It's even a Spanish translation of one that got to help with. It's a great resource. Yeah. Well, thank you, Bill. This has been just such a great conversation. For anyone interested, we're going to hop over, have a little bit more time on the Patreon page. And I just really appreciate your wisdom and everything that you share. This is such a crazy time, and I'm so thankful for leaders like yourself in this. So thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Josh. I'm thankful for you and everything you do and our friendship. So thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. For everyone, please review and rate the podcast wherever you listen, YouTube, Spotify, Apple's. It helps others find us. You can go to holyourselves.org if you're interested in spiritual direction or cohorts. Also, the Substack newsletter comes out every month. It's not coming out right now because I'm trying to finish this book, but it will be at some point. And you can go to patreon.com/holyourselves to get more resources and support the podcast. So thank you all. And thank you to the Transient friends for a theme song. And we'll talk to you soon. Bye, everyone.